All right, so we have Jorge Milian here to discuss Miami's all-time best 10 quarterbacks. When I thought of this idea, George, I had to go to you. You've covered the Hurricanes. You covered the Hurricanes from 1993 to 2012. I know there was a streak in there that you covered a number of games in a row. We're going to set this up. There's a lot of ways you can go with this. And the reason why I thought about this list, I saw it on our website on InsideTheU.com talking about Tyler Van Dyke. He's off to a good start. Does he crack the top 10? What would he have to do? We'll get more into Tyler. But I guess just kind of how'd you kind of come up with this list? I have a list too. I'm going to kind of share mine at the end here, but just how'd you kind of come up with this list and maybe your overall thoughts before we unveil your top 10 here?
Yeah, well, I kind of divided even when I was on the beat, into kind of two eras. Starting around the 1970s, where the beginning of what is modern day Miami started, but really with Lou Saban and everything before then. I think it's very impossible to compare the two eras of a football change, college football, integration, the passing game, everything changed really starting in the 70s. So I say that because my list does not include George Mira, which a lot of fans would think is sacrilege. I mean, I don't know if they've put anybody into the Hall of Fame or since then, but I think there's only four guys that have had their numbers retired. George Mira is one of them, and he's not on my list. He did throw more interceptions than touchdowns, so I know he was more of a running quarterback. It was a different game. He's not on my list, so I just kind of. These guys are all from 75, Jim Kelly on, pretty much the president. I don't include Tyler. I know we're going to talk about it, because I really wanted, the full career, and maybe at the end, Tyler is, on this list, but I'm just taking guys who played the 4 years or most of the 4 years, like Kaya and Kozar, who left early, but, full careers at
And George, and before we started this video, we were talking quite a bit, just kind of catching up, which is great. I have a lot of respect for you, for what you've did at covering I always enjoyed working with you and talking with you, football and everything else. So, one of the best to do it. So we definitely had to get this thing going. So anyway, let's get into it. So what do you got? So yeah, George Mira is certainly an interesting one. The stats, especially if you look back at some stuff, I want you to get into your list. For my list too, one thing that I always looked at was kind of almost in relation, even you touched on the years, even if we're talking 10, 20 years, like not that long, kind of in relation to how they were with their peers in college football. I thought that was a big way. I kind of looked at some things too, but we'll get into that. So what do we got here? I mean, certainly quarterback a lot of attention on football over the years and a lot of success. One thing that's interesting, touched on national titles. I mean, these guys that you're going to mention, the guys you're looking at, either won a national title or a Heisman Trophy or, just whatever it was, they were certainly headliners in college football during their times there. So let's start it off. What do you got number 10 here?
Number 10, it may have been the toughest decision because there's been so many good quarterbacks. You can really feel, I think 1 through 9 are no-brainers. But number 10, I'm going to put Scott Covington in there. I covered Scott Covington. I think Scott Covington would have had a much better career if he had been able to play sooner. I really think that was one of Butch Davis's biggest mistakes. He started Ryan Clement over Scott Covington for a couple years, even though I think anybody could have seen that Scott Covington was a much better, athletically much the better player. I think Butch went with Ryan Clement because Ryan was a fiery guy, a competitive guy, and those teams were really young in the mid-1990s. Scott was a quiet guy. But, the one season that he played, which I believe it was 1998, he was very good. I think that was a little bit of the beginning of the return of back to, the 2001 team and all that. He had the win against UCLA. That was the Edgerrin James game. Edgerrin ran for 299 yards, but Scott was a starting quarterback, and that was a number 3 UCLA team they beat. And Miami, if you recall, they were coming off a disastrous loss to Syracuse. I think Donovan McNabb put like 66 points up against them. And but that was a big win. That was a big win. And I think it got some of the UM players believing again, which was from 1995 until through 97. It was hard to believe. It was some tough years there. So I'm going to put Scott Covington just ahead of Brock Berlin, who who had a rocky career himself. He was the last guy to take Miami to what was then the BCS Bowl game. That was in, I guess, in 2003. But that year, Brock really didn't have a very good year. I think, if I recall correctly, he threw more interceptions than touchdowns that year, and that team was about running and a great defense. So I'm going to give Scott Covington a nod just a bit ahead of Brock Berlin at number 10.
Yeah, Brock's certainly an interesting case. Great points with Scott Covington and just that 1 year, what he was able to do. That's what's kind of interesting with this list. You could guys either played 1, 2, 3. Sometimes with how often they or how much they played and got in there. Covington's certainly an interesting one. There's another guy that I think didn't play a whole lot at Miami that I have on my list, so we'll talk more about him. Maybe he'll pop up on yours too. But going with Berlin, what's interesting with him and Brock, 2003 was my first year covering it. And Brock was certainly, that team had a chance to win a national title and just didn't get the play that they needed from Brock, but turns around in 04. George, if you remember this is something that almost doesn't get mentioned, but Miami could have won the ACC that year. Brock Berlin could have been ACC Player of the Year until that final game, the loss to Virginia Tech at home. Brock still led the ACC in passing yards, touchdowns, and efficiency, but Brian Randall got the nod for ACC Player of the Year because essentially Virginia Tech won that game and won the ACC. Miami would have split it 3 ways, but would have had the tiebreaker over Virginia Tech and Florida State. So Miami almost won the ACC in 04 before they actually had before they had the championship game. And certainly we all know Miami hasn't won the ACC. But yeah, Brock turned it around that second year, but just so bad in that first year. But yeah,
and he had certainly the Florida game. He had he beat Florida. That big comeback. That was a marquee game. Really, in those years. It was an incredible victory. Things were looking so great after that game, really, and so yeah, I think if you say Brock Berlin ahead of Scott Covington, I really couldn't argue it. Certainly if you take his second season as a starter over the first season.
Yeah, and 5-0 against Florida and Florida State at Miami. If you're into the wins thing, looking at that though, he did have an interception in all 5 of those games, 9 total in those 5, but certainly helped winning as well. Well, let's keep this thing moving. I'll get into my list, but Brock's certainly an interesting one. Scott Covington, a great one. So you said 1 through 9 are essentially obvious. So what do you got? Because my list is a little more difficult to come through. But what do you got at number 9?
I got Stephen Morris, who was the last quarterback I covered when I was on the beat. I just, Stephen Morris came to Miami. I don't recall him being a big recruit or anything like that, but, he was a really tough kid. He was very productive. He was coming in, I think Ja'Cory Harris was the starting quarterback then, and maybe they should have gone to Stephen Morris earlier. But I thought, I just remember him being like, this term is thrown around, and they weren't a great team, but I always thought Stephen Morris himself was a winner. Like again, a tough kid, a good leader, a little quiet, but just real athletic, and just didn't have the team around him. You could say maybe didn't have the coaching around him either, but I think he's a solid. He was a solid quarterback. Just didn't have maybe the certainly didn't have the 2001 team, or those kind of athletes around him that other guys did.
Yeah, and the big number, he had those big games, over 400 yards a few times, a 566. I mean, just could really get it going in games. And I remember watching him at high school there, Monsignor Pace, and really speaking, even though he wasn't a highly regarded guy, I kind of put my hand down on the ground for him. I really believed in him. I spoke highly about him at that time. So he certainly had an interesting career. And yeah, the wins, and you talked about the coaching, because we're going to get into some guys that certainly had both good teams around him and good coaching. So Morris at 9. What do you got at 8 here?
I got Brad. Let's see, just to make sure. Yeah, Brad Kaya. Who Brad? I didn't. I had left the beat by the time he started as a quarterback. But what I remember about Brad Kaya, and again, I wasn't on the beat, but I just wonder what what could have been if he had returned for his senior season. Because as I recall, again, just watching him on TV, I thought he was an excellent quarterback. I didn't know I didn't know much about him coming in, but he was one of these guys that I rarely ever saw him play poorly. I mean, I'm sure he had his games, and not covering it day to day, I don't have the recall of his career like I do some other guys. But I wonder, if he had returned for his senior season, what might have been, just not only for him but for Miami.
Yeah, definitely. And stepped right in, true freshman, and then goes on to have that good year. Led the ACC in either touchdowns or passing yards immediately. So certainly, and again, the numbers he put up, real consistent guy, 3,000 yards each year, those 3 years. I find that to be an interesting discussion in terms of when we're talking about Tyler Van Dyke. It's his third year as a starter. It's his fourth year in the program. And yeah, how do you evaluate a guy, Kai after his third year, for example, and Van Dyke after his fourth year? And there's other guys too that, as you mentioned, that left early. But yeah, certainly if Kaya would have came back, what would that have looked like? And certainly Kaya gets a lot of credit for that fit, just the wins and winning a bowl game really ignited, kind of passed the torch out when he left, and Malik Rozier and the team kind of took off that next season, and certainly Kaya with how he performed, in some games. But yeah, certainly interesting. What number 8? Who you got at 7? We're going to get into some big hitters. I'm looking forward to seeing how this shuffles around here. I'm writing them down to make sure I got your list here in comparison with mine. But we're at number 7 here.
And we're basing this purely on their college careers. So my number 7 is Jim Kelly. I mean, Jim Kelly is the best NFL quarterback produced by the University of Miami, not even close. But if you just take his college career, he had the monumental win against Penn State. That really is where, if you want to point to something, maybe Lou Saban's hiring, even before Howard, Schnellenberger, but that win against Penn State was monumental. I mean, this is a team, I'm not sure when it had happened, but they weren't far off. They lost to Florida A&M maybe a year before. It hadn't been too far prior to the Penn State victory. Back when what were Division I AA teams were never, ever beating Division I-A teams. And so that's where Miami's program was, and Jim Kelly really, got it going. People forget he, missed most of his senior season. I think that's another thing you have to be taken into consideration. I don't remember exactly. I know he only played maybe a couple of games early in his senior season. He got hurt, and that was it. So that's why, although again, Jim Kelly, if we were just ranking, their entire careers, Jim Kelly would be number 1. I think. But in this case, taken into account, 32 touchdown passes, 28 interceptions, maybe good for some quarterbacks that we saw later on, but not when you're talking about, the Testaverdes, the Kozars, the Walshes. That's why I have him at 7.
Yeah, he's certainly a difficult one to put in this list, and that's how I wanted this list to go, of how they did at UM. He's even with that injury and those statistics, he still became a first-round pick and certainly took off from there at NFL. I was just looking up as you were talking about, a month before the Penn State game, they lost to Florida A&M, so same season. So certainly, that's interesting and certainly would have been surprising. But yeah, Jim Kelly essentially got this whole thing going with the, after the Myra situation, after Myra, but really the headliner with Kelly kind of really changing the narrative of Miami quarterbacks, and all these guys came after him that we're talking about here. So number 7, I think it's fair. I think certainly it's fair. Again, it's hard to kind of put, and with that, George, he might be the number 1 guy if we did a list on guys more successful after they left UM. I think he could be.
No doubt. Yeah. I mean, was he the quarterback for all 4 of the Buffalo Bills Super Bowl appearances? I mean, I know he didn't win any of them, but that's hard to get to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the teams that win it, it's hard to get back, even in their stretches. So to do it 4 times. Let's keep it going. Number 6. What do you got here? I have a feeling, I have a guess, but what do you got here?
Well, actually, I don't know. National championships were a big deal. I do have and I'll explain this later. I have Craig Erickson at number 6. He did win a national championship in 91. When I was putting this list together that we spoke before, and I said, to me, national championships are bigger than anything, especially when you're considering these quarterbacks against each other. If you won a national championship, I think that's a slam dunk. Although I have somebody ahead of Craig Erickson that didn't win one, but Craig Erickson, when I think his career, he was 26-1, and I think of Craig Erickson. Before I covered I was watching every game, and I still think that's the greatest play in history. Is the 3rd and 43 to Randall Hill against Notre Dame. I mean, I remember clearly watching that game and that play, and it was the most unbelievable thing. I mean, we consider how good Notre Dame was and the whole thing. So on that, and again, he was 26-1. It's pretty incredible. I got Erickson, Palm Beach guy, on number 6.
We'll get into Ken Dorsey and where he kind of slots in, but I know when we talk about Dorsey, for example, the wins and everything else, but when you look at because of the total of wins that he had, the record was certainly impressive. But when you look at all these guys, they all have those kind of similar numbers as starters. You said, his record and these other guys, 1, 2, they didn't lose very many games. You talk about national titles. I mean, one thing I want to briefly say this with kind of when we're talking about Berlin, and some of these other quarterbacks and the ones we're getting ready to talk about now. To me, it is much different performing with those high expectations, the target on your back, the competing for national titles. I felt like if we talked about like Kyle Wright, it's not going to be on my list either, but Kyle Wright, for example, I thought it was just much different. The spotlight he was in, the expectations to be a national title contender year in and year out. And I feel like when you have that compared to kind of things we've seen over recent years, winning 5, 6, 7 games in a season without the pressure, I just think it's much different, particularly at that quarterback position. And I think these guys, performing and with expectations of competing for titles and whatnot, I thought Brock was under that spotlight, and Kyle too, even though he didn't have those numbers. I just think it's much different. And so these guys, and they're a big part of it. That's what my probably.
The quarterbacks have a lot to do with it because you start with Kelly and then Kozar, and these guys were so good that whoever was coming in had to be at least that good. So it wasn't just the pressure to perform, but the pressure to perform like the guy before you did. That's tough to do, and became almost impossible, obviously, for a lot of these guys.
And what's interesting, these guys, backgrounds from all over. It's really fun kind of seeing, Pennsylvania, California. We'll get into Florida, as we just mentioned here. All right, top 5, 6. These are good, 6 through 10. I like it so far. Top 5. And again, I know people watching this, they're going to have their own list, and they're going to provide top 10s are always tough, but top 5. Here we go. Number 5. What do we got here?
Well, the only guy that didn't win a title was Vinny Testaverde, and I got him, I thought long and hard. I mean, physically, maybe the best quarterback at what he could do, if not for the Fiesta Bowl, he might be 1 or 2 or, certainly higher on this list. I mean, I don't think you can. I mean, that team was so good. I always say the 2001 University of Miami team is the best team in college football. People don't remember this, but that game, the 2001 team in the national championship against Ohio State, check it out, started 10 number 1 draft picks. 10 number 1 draft picks. And that doesn't include guys like Vernon Carey, Kellen Winslow, Antro Rolls, Sean Taylor, who were all backups. So I still think that the 86 Fiesta Bowl team might have matched them in talent, except that then Vinny threw the 5 picks in that game. And again, just taking it all into context, I think he would have been higher except for that game. And again, it was tough for me to pick him over Testaverde. Craig Erickson, because Craig Erickson's 26-1 and won a national championship. But I think I'll give it to Testaverde. I thought he was a great quarterback. That year, I thought they were unstoppable. I think everybody thought. I think they thought that they were unstoppable. And then the Penn State happened.
Yeah, and certainly with that, just kind of piggybacking off your thought, I remember talking or having conversations with former players about that team, and you talk to them, guys in that era, guys that kind of played essentially before 2000, they point to that as the best team ever. They'll take that over the 01 team. It just shows you how good that team was, how highly thought of they were. But again, they didn't cap it off, and Vinny certainly didn't play well in that game. It's interesting with where you have him. I've got an interesting place where I have him, but certainly it's certainly hard to ignore with what happened there in the Fiesta Bowl, and certainly a surprise to everybody. And I think it's really stuck with him. I think it's been, even though he had so much, the playing in the NFL for so long, win a Super Bowl, certainly that one. So you touched on, winning being a big part, and Tyler Van Dyke, when we talked about him, he said it recently in an interview in terms of what he wants to do, kind of his goals. And he said, he wants to win and feels like the accolades and all that. And it feels like certainly to be on this list, all these guys won a bunch of games, and Tyler, his story is still yet to be written, but certainly winning is a big part of history. Certainly the fans expect it, but to be one of the best quarterbacks. And I remember when this started to change, but you had to win a bunch of games to be considered among the greatest. So let's go. Number 4, what do we got, George?
And this is, all these quarterbacks, some of them had great physical abilities, others not so much. I'm a big fan of his. I like him personally. My number 4 is Gino Torretta. And I say that because I think Gino was not that. He didn't have the big physical skills or anything. But, he just produced, I think, what was he, 26-1. He obviously won the 1991 national championship. He was 26-1. Could have been 27-0 and could have been number 1 on this list with the only quarterback to have 2 national championships, save for George Teague. Because again, 26-1, the one loss was to Alabama, and Gino did everything. Won the Heisman, put up huge numbers. He had great receivers, but Gino didn't make mistakes. Gino was Ken Dorsey before Ken Dorsey was Ken Dorsey. And but again, if not for that, really, maybe that one play, I think, again, Gino would have been the only one on this list with 2 titles. I mean, where he was a starter. I mean, I think one of the somebody else here, maybe it was Craig Erickson, not sure, but it was a backup, not counting that. We're talking about starters here. So that's where I put Gino as number 4.
Yeah, and that's certainly interesting with what he did. He definitely, won the Heisman Trophy, obviously, certainly had that big year in the national. That's what's interesting too. Essentially, most of these guys started for 2 years, and essentially a lot of them, really good individually, good team successes. If you kind of generalize most of these guys, that's kind of how their recipe or what their resume looks like with a lot of these guys. But Gino at 4 might surprise some people, again, because he did win Heisman and the national title. So that just kind of shows you how much success Miami's had at quarterback. But all right, top 3, we're in it here. I don't know what you're going to do at number 1. I have an idea. But what do we got here? Well, actually, I don't. I am curious because we have not talked about it, obviously, writing it down as we speak. Number 3, top 3, where are you going here?
Number 3, I got Steve Walsh. And I want to look at my notes here real quick. Okay, 23-1 as a starter in 87 and 88. And this is before some of our fans were born, probably. But his one loss, and he won the 87 national championship. His one loss, as you recall, Chris, is the blown call. What was the Cleveland Gary call against Notre Dame? That was his one loss. And another guy that, could have won 2 national championships here and been number 1 on the list. And Walsh was another guy. I mean, there's several guys on this list that it's hard to recall them making many mistakes, like these guys didn't throw interceptions. These guys didn't make dumb plays. They weren't, and Steve Walsh, again, not the greatest arm in history, not the best runner or any of that, but just was a great college football quarterback.
And that's, in a lot of these too, again, the success that they had as a team and individual, it's kind of like essentially right when they got, a lot of these guys had a lot of success there that first year as a starter. As soon as they got in, when it was their opportunity, they took advantage of it. And it kind of, year after year, whenever it was their turn, for a long time, whenever it was their turn, they definitely stepped up. And Walsh certainly, when the other day I was in the stadium and I was looking at the Ring of Honor, just looking at all the names because I knew we were going to do this, and I was just kind of looking up. And I think to me, among all the guys that have their number, their name, and that Ring of Honor that has at the stadium, I think he's almost maybe the most underappreciated of the all-time greats. Just kind of looking at the rest of the guys and how people talk about him and think about him. And maybe it is part of because it has been a while since he played there, and 88 was his last year at but certainly a great player. We talked about guys from all different parts of the country. Certainly Steve there fits that bill. So top two, you could go either way. I really, when I said it just recently, which way you were going to go, I still don't know where you're going to go with this one, because I think you can go either one. I think fans know which two are left, but what do you got at number two?
Well, the guy that I covered, and Ken Dorsey, I got at number two. And what Ken, again, the numbers on Dorsey are just 38-2 as a starter. And let's talk, those two losses were at Washington. And I'm getting old, Chris, but Washington, did they win the national championship that year? Or they were in the running for they were a one-loss team, I believe.
Yeah, they had won theirs earlier before that.
Okay, yeah, they had one. And then I believe they ended up a one-loss team, and that was at Washington. I think it was the first or second game of the season. I recall some poor coaching decision. I think big play in that, as I remember, the start of the fourth quarter, they got a delay of game penalty because of some stuff that was going on in the sidelines. It proved to be a big play. And then, of course, the Ohio State loss in the national championship. Again, Ken wins that game. No fault of his own. He really, you could say he did win that game. He could be easily number one on this list. Again, a guy that from the first time that guy played, and just real quick, I'll never forget this. Back in the old days, they used to bring on all the recruits, the freshmen. We would interview, and I'll never forget sitting in that media room, and this tall, lanky kid walks in, and it's Ken Dorsey. And we all looked at each other wondering, how is this guy going to ever survive getting hit by like Al Blades in practice, for instance? Ken Dorsey turned out to be maybe the toughest kid I ever covered at and talk about no mistakes. I mean, from day one, I think he took over for Kenny Kelly, right? From day one, the guy just, everything he did was correct on the football field. No surprise. He's an offensive coordinator now, and could probably be a great coach. You can definitely make him number one, and I have no argument with it.
And I think a lot of people would, a lot of either recent fans or just the way it does. He's the most recent guy that had a lot of success of this group. George, I remember, because I started in 03, essentially, Dorsey finished in 02. So I remember asking you early on just about Dorsey, what he was like. And I remember one thing you said, essentially, because all the wins and things like that. But I remember one of the things that stood out to me when I asked you about him and his success. And it was that first year when he did step in for Kelly in 99 there, and played the 4 games and won those. And essentially, I remember you saying you just kind of knew he had it, right when he got on the field. Essentially, you talk about a guy that no mistakes kind of a thing, and he just had it immediately. And I think that's what stood out to me in terms of the way you would talk about him. Obviously, we see the stats and the numbers and all that stuff and all the wins. And one of those guys that was certainly on top of the college football world with how he was performing. And I don't think I think some people might say, oh, he had a lot of talent around him. And that's obviously true to a certain extent. A lot of that, a lot of guys' talent, defensively, a lot of those guys, sometimes if you look at Dorsey's receivers, he had Andre Johnson. But after that, he played with some good tight ends and great tight ends, obviously. But he did have talents. He had some great running backs. But I think he does deserve a lot of credit for all those guys and all the wins. He maximized that essentially. Another guy, and another guy that could have won another national title. We're talking about guys that have won one, and so many of these guys are close to 2, which is just phenomenal. It's really hard to do in college football to get 2 titles. All right, so here, number one, we're finally here. The number one quarterback, the greatest quarterback in Miami Hurricanes football history. George, who do you got here?
I gotta go with Bernie Kosar. I think people, in 1983 is a long time ago, even for old guys like myself. I think fans, I think there's a lot of fans that weren't even born then that don't recall how huge that game was, or how unlikely it seemed that Miami beating Nebraska, who was at the top of the college football world then, how unlikely that seemed the day of that game. And, without that game, Bernie Kosar is playing in that victory, we may not even be having this discussion because I think, Bernie Kosar and that victory, then it just put this attention on and everybody started to come. And it did become, the quarterbacks, they had no problem getting the top quarterbacks in the country after Bernie Kosar. I remember Bernie coming to practices, and, they've had all sorts of stars throughout their history, but he was the big deal, the big, kahuna. And again, I just think without that victory, against Nebraska, there might not be a top 10 list, and we might be talking about very average guys. And again, it's been so long. I mean, 40 years, it's crazy. But I think, and Bernie left a year early, as I recall. I mean, he could have just added to his to all the things that he did. Like I said before, him and Kai were two guys that left early. And with good reason, but that's why I put Bernie number one. I don't know that he was necessarily better than a Dorsey or a Walsh, but without him, again, I might be at the gym right now, lifting weights, and not talking about the top 10 quarterbacks in history.
And certainly kind of from a coaching perspective too, with Howard Schnellenberger getting it all started, he gets a lot of credit if we were to do a coaches list, essentially starting this thing off. And it's interesting too with Bernie, the guys he played with, the competition and certainly emerging. You touched on it too, as we mentioned, winning big games, but we didn't see the full 4 years or whatever that might have been, and what it might have looked like. Maybe he would have been even better and even more highly regarded than he already is. And maybe there'd be no doubt with where he stands, but certainly got it all started. I remember when I first started covering had a chance to meet him early on, and understanding and really learning more about football and his place in it and his importance in it. And everybody remembers that 83 championship game. You touched on it, just how unlikely it was, and they pulled it off, and it set this whole thing in motion. These are some of the best, not just at I mean, these are some of the best quarterbacks in college football history, many of them, with what they were able to do. And these records, the wins and losses, how everything shakes out with these guys. But certainly a fantastic list. And yeah, as we started from the top of can Tyler Van Dyke kind of get his name? Can he be among Miami's top 10 quarterbacks of all time?
Well, again, he's got to win. It's hard to say, but I think he's got me the top 10. Yes, I mean he obviously has the qualities. You could see it, but we're not talking about. We're talking about to make this list. You really gotta win. And that's the number one thing. Maybe the guys at the back end of this list know, but I think Tyler Van Dyke, I think he's thinking being more towards the front of this list, and it's just about winning. And a lot of times, it doesn't have to do with the quarterback. These guys, Ken Dorsey, yeah, he had unbelievable talent. Bernie Kosar, if you look at that team, not so much. That's another thing with Bernie. There was great talent after, and there was talent on that team, no doubt about it. But it wasn't, what the 2001 team or the 86 team, it wasn't like that. And so I think, with Tyler, it'll just a lot of have to do with how, let's see how things have gone very well this season. Looks good. It's looked good before. He looks like a quarterback. I mean, when I see him play, I see more like one of these top guys, and some of the guys that we ended up seeing during our time together that didn't make this list. And he definitely has the qualities, but it's the bottom line game, man. and bottom line is wins and losses. Everything else, it's all scoreboard. Otherwise, stats are nice, but don't win you championships. That's been proven.
Yeah, and one thing to add on that is just you touched on early for with Tyler. We've seen Tyler play well in stretches. We've seen him in chunks. We've seen him play well, and then we've obviously seen him not play well. And losses have happened with that. So yeah. So my top 10 list. I want to get your reaction. I'm not going to break it all down because you obviously did a great job of breaking these guys down. But let's start. I'm going to start at the with my list here, and I'm going to kind of just put it up. I guess we'll kind of just do like a six. I'll just throw my first my 6 through 10 out here, and just showing you real quick and with the graphic here. But with Tyler, I don't have him in the top 10. And mine is actually my number 6 is the same as yours. I'm going Craig Erickson at 6 and Jim Kelly at 7. That's exactly how you had it. So I had those two guys. But this is where it gets a little interesting. And I think a lot of people wouldn't have this guy at number 8, and that's De'Aaron King. He was only here. He was only here for that one full season as a starter. Gets hurt after 3 games into his next year, and that was it. He wasn't a guy recruited. He didn't have the hype as a recruit that a lot of these recent guys, where people get to know these guys as a recruit and as a high school prospect. He showed up at Miami at a very interesting time, and it will be as we look back at 2020 in the world, but certainly in the sports world, college football world, very interesting time. But De'Aaron comes in. One thing I want to note on De'Aaron, and arguably, I mean, it didn't have a lot of running quarterbacks, and he's arguably the best running quarterback, guy that could run the best in terms of his passing. There were some other guys that had some stats. We touched on Malik Rozier. Kenny Kelly could run, but combining both, I mean, De'Aaron was the best dual threat guy on this list. So he did it there. He threw the ball very efficiently. This is an interesting stat that I want to point with De'Aaron in doing this research, the highly efficient numbers passing. But one thing that De'Aaron did, he didn't, Miami was unranked. They were not a top 25 team the 18 games before De'Aaron arrived. Miami's unranked the game he first played in, and then after that, 13 straight games of having a top 25 team in the country. Now, he didn't win a national title, but Miami was a good team, often in the top 10, top 15. So they were one of the best teams in the country. De'Aaron leading the way. So I've got De'Aaron number 8. Number 9, I got Brad Kaya. Again, because of the things we said, the consistency of the performances, only 3 years, he could have stacked on it. Maybe he could have moved up, but again, with all these other guys, you got to win a lot of games at a high mark. But yeah, Kaya, the completion percentage, the day one as a true freshman, immediately stepping in. Obviously he could have won a little bit more games, but the passing yards obviously are impressive with the touchdowns. And number 10, I am giving respect to George Myra, but I am leaving that open because I had a hard time. It's really hard looking at those touchdown interception numbers. But the one thing I'll say is with where he ranked amongst college football, passing the ball at that time, one of the best. So I give him his respect. But certainly I think that spot is open. And certainly Tyler, that'd be the first spot to go. And the thing is, if he wins more, can he pass Kaya? Can he pass De'Aaron King, a guy that he played with when he first got to UM? So that's my 6 through 10 there. Now taking a look at the top 5, we're mostly correct. Or just I want to get your reaction to the 6 through 10 as I go. Again, Erickson, Kelly, 6, 7, De'Aaron King, if you got a thought on that, and then Brad Kaya, George Myra, my 6 through 10.
Yeah, and I think De'Aaron King is a real good one. You make a great point about not winning the national championship, but producing, and the fact that I didn't know that stat. I was away from the beat, and I was just starting out my career as a cops reporter. So not starting, but I was knee deep at that point, and maybe not paying enough attention. But that stat that you bring up about the number of weeks in a row after he became a starter where they were ranked, I think that says it all. Again, it's a bottom line business, and I think you're right putting him there ahead of like a Stephen Morris or even a Brad Kaya, who had the numbers, had big numbers, but not. They certainly did not spend their entire starting careers ranked. That did not happen. So I think that's very much in line. And I don't have a problem with George Myra at 10. I mean, throw a bone to the old guys. I'm one of them. We need to be patted on the back every now and then.
Yeah, well, I certainly look old too. I'm not hiding that part of it either. Yeah, and De'Eric too. 8-3 and 20. I think that 2020 team almost gets overlooked sometimes, but 8-3, I think you think, oh, the 8 wins. But remember them with the schedule. They didn't get that extra non-conference game. I think that could have been obviously 9-3. They missed out on a chance to another ACC game that they were better than. That could have been a 10-win team, and we talked about 10-win teams, only one since 03. So certainly that story could have been written differently for De'Eric. And they lost the bowl game to Oklahoma State, but he gets hurt in that game. The North Carolina game stands out. Obviously, they get blown out by North Carolina and puts up 62, but De'Eric's not playing defense and not playing linebacker and stopping the run game. So that wasn't his fault. It's hard to put that one on him. So again, they won games. It wasn't obviously the high marks of these other guys, but that's where I have him. And also, too, the culture when he jumped in, I think without question, we talk about different list. If we were to do a list on top transfers in history, De'Eric deserves to be there as one of those guys, and if certainly not the best transfer they've ever gotten. The 50 touchdowns at Houston was certainly impressive. So highly productive, highly thought of guy that I think might get overlooked a little bit just in history. But okay, top 5. George, when we're doing this list, I felt like the top 5 can shuffle a bit. And I don't know how hard you had on your decision, but mine are different than yours. And it starts right here. My 1 and 5 are absolutely switched. I have Vinny Testaverde as the number 1 quarterback in Miami history, and I have Bernie Kosar 5. But I want to talk about, let's start with Vinny. And the other guys are the same. I had 2. I had Dorsey number 2. You had him 2. Steve Walsh 3, and Gino Toretto 4. That's exactly how I have it on my list. But let's talk more about Vinny. Again, my points on him. And it's hard to overlook that game. And I understand that the 5 interceptions, everything was going great with that team and success. And I know that I think this would surprise people that I still have him as the best quarterback in history, even with that game. And I just want to point out these numbers here. Again, he wins the Heisman Trophy, but he's also the number 1 pick in the draft. Looking at his numbers, his passing touchdowns, he had 26 that led the country that year. The next quarterback on the Heisman list, number 3 overall in the votes, had a running back 2, but number 3, essentially the second best quarterback. The way it was viewed in terms of Heisman voters was Jim Harbaugh, who threw 10 touchdowns that year with 8 picks. So, I just think Vinny clear cut the best quarterback, the best player in the country that year. He won the Heisman by a landslide. And I just felt like looking at that, his attributes with what he was able to do, throwing the ball, a big guy that could make the throws. And I think if he wins that game, it's a no question. I think he's number 1 on everybody's list. If he wins that game, they only lost 14-10, even with the 5 interceptions, the 7 total turnovers. Things would have, history would have been written differently. I think it would have been a no question number 1. But still, for me, again, he's still number 1 on my list on that, even with that game. I just think with what he was able to do in comparison to his peers, he had a really high passer efficiency rating that year, 165, which at that time was certainly high. That'd be high even in today's game. So the 26 touchdowns that final year, the certainly stand out. So, and then over 3,000 the year before. So I have Vinny number 1. And on the flip side with Kosar, just to touch on him, the 2 years of the interceptions kind of stood out to me in terms of, if we're looking at the totality of it. They didn't win a bunch of games, 8-5 that second season after winning the title, but certainly you have him number 1. I don't think there's any question. I could have moved him up to 2, especially considering his skill set. We talked about the draft and what he was thought of at that time amongst college football greats. So certainly, but that's kind of where I see that. And again, Vinny, I certainly think it's an interesting conversation. There's no doubt about it. And certainly I understand not everybody would be on board with that.
Yeah. And I mean, there's no doubt when it comes to physical skills. I mean, Vinny Testaverde is number 1, and whoever else. I mean, it could be like a Stephen Morris or at number 2 for physical. There's no question. But it's like we were talking before. It's just such a almost the Dan Marino conversation back in the 80s. Is Dan Marino the greatest quarterback? When you rate these the best of all time, it's so hard to have any dividing points. That I think he didn't win a Super Bowl. Is it his fault? The defense was terrible the year Miami went to the Super Bowl. Nevertheless, and San Francisco's defense were a lot better than Miami. And Dan Marino had unbelievable numbers. But in the end, when it's so the lines are so fine between these guys. I think when what you do in the national championship game. Bernie Kosar performed. Vinny, he didn't. I mean, the bottom line, they were so great that you're right. They were so great that they had 7 turnovers and they lost by 4 points. That's unbelievable. But it's like the thing is that the reality is, I think you could get the top 6 guys, maybe even Kelly, but certainly the top 6 guys, put them in going into national championship game, pull one out of a hat, and you'd be fine with it.
Yeah, and I think if you put them in different eras, a lot of these guys would have had success on other teams.
Absolutely.
What would Vinny have looked like with 01, or all these guys? I mean, Erickson, or even a Scott Covington, as you mentioned, to start this thing off. What would it look like if he played with some of these guys? I find that to be interesting when you talk about list and stuff. And yeah, the winning, it's certainly a big part of it, and everything that they did. And the thing is, too, again, not only did they not win, I understand that Vinny was a big part of that. I understand that. I think it's been something that has stuck with him and his reputation the whole time. And it's understandably so, especially what happened. They did win before, they got the one before him, but the 4 after him, all these guys afterwards, they all can say they have won a title. So it's an impressive list altogether. And I think when we talk about Tyler or anybody else coming after Tyler, if we just take the top 7 and we have Jim Kelly 7th, what you have to do to essentially be, let's say 7 out of it, what you have to do to be a top 5 quarterback in the history of this program is certainly going to be a difficult task for any of these guys. And these other guys that we didn't mention, yeah, maybe they could have been 8, 9, 10, or really, somewhere in that range. But they're not. They're outside the top 10 and not really, really threatening because of individual success, but also team success. And a lot of these guys too, again, they didn't have these ups and downs. I think when we talk about a Tyler, I know he did get hurt last year, but when he played, he didn't look great either. He didn't put up big numbers either. So it's tough, but you've got to be great essentially immediately and all the way around to be on this list. But a lot of good names. And again, Ken Dorsey, I think if we were to do a fan vote, I think without question, he would be the number 1 guy. If I were to guess, if we were to do a poll of some sort, and Dorsey gets a lot of credit for those wins, but he was a big factor in all that stuff. And as you mentioned, certainly his football career is phenomenal, what he's been able to do after too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no doubt. You think 38 wins, again, 2 losses. And the one was at Washington, which I think might have been the season opener in the second, everything runs together. But and then the Ohio State loss, which I still replay that interference, and I've never seen an ending like that. I covered 200 plus games in a row, and never anything. I'll never see anything like that again, I'm sure. But there was just the guy just didn't make mistakes. He didn't even throw bad passes, much less interceptions. So, and I saw every single one of his passes. So you're right. It's like this list. If you're going to crack this, you better bring the goods, man, because it's not an easy one.
And also the expectations of what a Miami quarterback is, from the fan base to everybody. Everybody knows what a great quarterback looks like at It's been proven. So, your quarterback always has a huge spotlight on them, certainly at a place like Miami that expects to win, regardless of results or how it's gone recently, or regardless of whoever the coach might be at the time. A Miami starting quarterback is expected to win games and put up good numbers and be one of the best in the country and lead the way. An exciting brand of football. So, George, I'm going to let you go. I appreciate this. This was great to discuss Miami football history, but also present, how it kind of fits in with what it looks like now. I know a lot of discussion when a new player comes through, they always think, oh, he's the next so-and-so. And it's, hey, you got to do a lot to be one of these guys, to be one of Miami's best, especially at quarterback, but all positions. And I think sometimes it gets thrown around too lightly, too much about how they're the next one, because these guys are phenomenal players. They've had so many guys that from all different eras that have been great players. So thank you for taking the time to doing this.
I appreciate it, Chris. There are a few things I like talking more about than football, University of Miami football. So We got to do a top 10 centers list next, or offensive guard, or whatever. I'm all in for it.
Yeah, that'd be exciting for the fans. I'm sure they'd want to hear that. So we'll come up with something. We'll come up with something. So drop in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Appreciate you guys. And thanks again, George.
All right, Chris. Thank you.